All right, welcome to Talking Time with Caffeine, the only podcast we take what no one's talking about and talk about anyways. I think my headphones are dying, so while try to find new ones, hopefully, I'll let the guest introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Jill. I go by Jillian Wren. I am kind of an amateur historian. I do a lot more about movies these days, but I have definitely done a fair amount of studying of history. I am here today to talk about the amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Um, I believe we're going to be talking about the history of how and why they got passed. Um, I have done another podcast, but the last one I did, I talked about Blackbeard's ghost, so this is going to be a little bit different. Okay?
Yeah. Well, here goes nothing. All right. So first of all, how did you learn about the amendment? Basically, school or stuff, or what?
It's a lot of school stuff. I went to a college that doesn't have majors, but if we did, my minor would have been in history, predominantly US history. And then in the mumble years since I graduated, I've done a fair amount of just continuing reading on the subject.
Awesome. All right. So let's get this. All right. Let's see if now it took a while and a lot of things, but I think I made the slides a bit because
Yeah, it's
I in the slideshow I I forgot how long these amendments are and try to put them in a box is a little tiny print like that.
yeah. Oh, and because it's not just legalese. For some of it it's 18th century legalese, which is even more dense and complicated. Some of those sentences, I don't know when or if they're going to end.
Right? How we change the Constitution. Now, what are amendments? How do they work?
So, our original form of government as a country was the Articles of Confederation, which didn't work. Just everybody very quickly knew that they did not work. And so in 1789, originally the plan was we're going to alter the Articles of Confederation, except basically everybody showed up to the Constitutional Convention knowing they were going to throw out the Articles of Confederation and start over. But as they worked on the Constitution, they realized that they were not going to be prepared for every single legal eventuality. And to leave themselves sort of a loophole, it says in the Constitution that the document itself can be changed following, fairly strict procedures and requirements, so that if the entire country or a substantial enough percentage of it agrees that something needs to be part of the foundational documents of the country, then that can become a law. And the Bill of Rights, the first 10, were the compromise to get the Constitution ratified at all. A lot of people did not like the Constitution, and one of the things they didn't like about it was that it didn't have a Bill of Rights. So the first thing we as a country did after really establishing ourselves was change our own rules to enshrine certain things as rights of citizens in the United States.
Yeah, it says to change it, well, to propose it, first you need 2/3 of both houses, and then you need 3/4 of this of this of the Senate and the House, and 3/4 of the states to
Yeah.
do it.
Yeah. It is difficult to get an amendment to the United States Constitution ratified.
It was probably much easier when 3/4 of 13 and 3/4 of 50.
Yeah, that is definitely true. Um, and but it's interesting if you note that the number of amendments goes up faster the further along you get. It was 10 for a really long time. And then it took until 1865 to get to number 13.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, my kid wanted fruit snacks. So, and then from 13 to the rest of them, just the pace of them has just been speeding up over the years.
Yeah. Hey, so what amendment would you like to see?
I mean, I'm the kind of person who really would like a specifically set constitutional limit on corporate personhood. I would really like that defined as our national law. Here's what rights and responsibilities a corporation in the United States has. And keep them out of our elections because they're not people in that sense. That would be my first choice if I could pick one.
So you don't want say Shell to be a voting person?
Man, I live in Washington State. Right now we got Jeff Bezos to worry about.
One vote for Jeff, one vote for whatever he does.
Yeah, one vote for Jeff, one vote for Amazon. At least Bill Gates seems to be sticking to getting people vaccines, which I can definitely support him on.
Well, let's talk about the one everyone knows about, at least. And that's number one.
Yeah, people get a lot wrong about number one. People miss the important part, which is the first word. Congress shall make no law. Freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences. It doesn't mean, everybody's got to give you a platform. It means, and this got expanded so it includes the states, but that's a 14th Amendment thing, which we'll get to. But it means the federal government cannot tell you what you can and cannot say, what you can and cannot print, who you can and cannot associate with, what you can and cannot believe. It is in the text of the Constitution itself that there can't be a religious test for office. But the First Amendment was what made it, it's legal in this country to believe whatever you want, even as a private citizen. And this one, the United States has kind of played fast and loose with freedom of the press since this was passed. In the early 19th century, you get sedition acts, and that gets really messy and complicated. But in theory, the First Amendment is where all of the other rights are based. Especially the last part, to petition the government for redress of grievances. You have the right to tell your representatives that you don't like how your government is going. They don't have to listen to you, but you have a right to tell them that. Um, in theory, this amendment
I can
means.
hear you again.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Could you not hear me for a
Sorry
second
for
there?
that.
Yeah.
A minute or
Um,
two.
well, I wasn't saying anything for a little bit too. So, but in theory, this amendment means that you, as an individual, have the right to think and believe and say what you want. And with that enshrined, that helps the government be the government that you want. I mean, you've got to convince a lot of other people to agree with you, obviously, but, you know, there's a reason they chose this one to be the first.
It's freaking. Um, says okay. It's, so so Congress can't make an official state religion.
Yeah. Yeah. A state religion in the United States is unconstitutional. And part of that was religion in. It was still England for most of the colonial era. Didn't become the United Kingdom until the 18th century, I think. But religion,
The Church of England.
yeah, that stems from originally, England was Catholic because that's kind of what Christian was. And then Henry wanted a divorce, and the Pope wouldn't give him one because it turns out you can't get your marriage annulled when your wife's cousin has an army in the Vatican.
Yeah, when your wife's cousin or nephew, I think nephew is the Holy Roman Empire.
Yeah.
And the king of.
Yeah. So, for the 200 years or so after what was called officially the King's Great Matter, religion in England was really complicated.
200
Because
years. Hey, you still can't be a Catholic and be king of England.
you still can't. No, it is still illegal. If you look far enough along the line of succession, you'll see people who are left out because they're Catholic. And I mean, they would be 28th in line for the throne if they weren't Catholic, so it does not really matter anyway. But there are still, to this day, people who cannot take the throne of England because they are Catholic. And that was after James II, I think, they passed that law.
Yeah, when his son-in-law and daughter took over.
Yeah. And so, I mean, religion in England leading up to 1789, it depended on who was in charge, and you got the whole Cromwell thing and back and forth and this and that, and waves of people trying to get away from whoever was in charge religiously in England at the time kept coming to the colonies. And
yeah. And even then, Massachusetts, it wasn't freedom of religion for them either. It was freedom for my religion, and anybody else can go.
I mean, there
themselves.
were one or two colonies that were freer of religion than the others, but there's a great book by Sarah Vowell called The Wordy Shipmates, which is about the Plymouth Bay colonists and their relationship to religion. And that's messy. And very much, you have the freedom to worship the way we want you to.
Yeah.
And the line they were walking, trying to please England enough so they didn't have their charter revoked, but still do what they wanted to do and what they believed they were called upon by God to do. And so basically the First Amendment was like, look, we're avoiding all of that nonsense. You believe what you want to, we don't care. And in, I think it was the 1800 election, there was a congregation that voted, like Baptists or something, that agreed to vote for Jefferson over Adams because they preferred an atheist to an Episcopalian and felt the atheist was more likely to leave them alone than the Episcopalian was. So the relationship the founding fathers had to religion was not the way a lot of people picture it today. It was a lot messier.
You mean it wasn't a Christian nation?
Oh man. I want to slap those people with a copy of Thomas Jefferson's Bible, which he edited to leave out this is a direct quote, obvious exaggerations by Jesus' biographers, which includes the resurrection. Thomas Jefferson edited a version of the Bible that leaves out the resurrection. Good Christian stuff.
Yeah. And also, I like to point out to people, if we ever if we get a state religion, and what if one day that state religion isn't the religion you like? So you're out of luck then.
Yeah.
Like, all of a sudden, say majority religion. Okay, all of a sudden, maybe all of a sudden Muslims are control the United States.
What a lot of people don't realize is that these early anti-church and state laws were passed at least as much to protect the church as to protect the state. Because they knew at the time very, very well how a church that believes a fairly slight difference from what you believe can still make your life as a person of faith miserable. Broadly speaking, these were all groups that believed the same rough thing. And some of the differences in theology are so exhaustingly nitpicky.
Like, yeah, I know the you're not a real Christian thing from like Quakers, Catholics, whoever, Orthodox.
But I mean, these were even just different kinds of Protestant. The Plymouth Bay settlers were going from what was at the time a Protestant nation to form their own slightly different Protestant area. These were not extreme differences in a lot of cases. They were points of doctrine that would probably take half an hour to explain to get someone today to fully understand them. But it had been bad enough for them to cross 3,000 miles of ocean.
Yeah. I'll talk about the same topic too. It's like when people say, we took away prayer from school. No, we didn't. The kids can still pray if they want to. I prayed a little bit when I was still a Christian and thing, but it's just the teacher cannot make you do it.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a court case not that far from me about a coach who was making the kids pray, and it's like, no, he doesn't get to lead the team in prayer. That's the point. The kids could pray if they choose to.
Yeah, if a kid wants to say a silent prayer, like, please don't get my head knocked off in this next football game.
Right.
Thank you. No cousins, please. God, thank you. They can.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the idea that the separation of church and state is there to protect the state from the church is exactly backwards from how it was originally intended. And I think it's just as valuable in both directions. But the people who wrote these laws would be bewildered by this attitude that the state should reflect your specific religious beliefs, and that's the important problem, as opposed to preventing the state from making your religion believe a thing.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Okay. Freedom of speech. I mean, you can say stuff, but like I said, you can't go out there and I heard this argument before. You can't yell fire or something.
Yeah, it's a misquote. The statement is supposedly you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, and it's you can't falsely yell fire in a crowded theater.
That's what I meant.
Yeah. And the thing is you aren't protected. There's a lot of back and forth. There has been for, a couple of centuries now about exactly how far your right to freedom of speech goes. I think it was Oliver Wendell Holmes who said that my right to swing my fist ends where the other man's nose begins. So I can't go around lying about you all I want to. That's illegal. I would suffer consequences from doing that if it could be shown that what I said had damaged you. Now, I can call, for example, one of my exes, I can call him a waste of space, and no one can do anything about that because that's a statement of opinion. And I'm entitled to my opinion and I'm entitled to express it. But if, God's forbid, my ex owned Facebook and banned me for saying on Facebook that I thought he was a waste of space, he'd be absolutely within his rights.
Yeah, that's the thing. People get like a few years ago, like when they banned the ex-president
Yes.
from Twitter and Facebook. It's Twitter was not a public square statement. It was a privately owned company.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't have the right to someone else's platform. That is not what the First Amendment says. And I think that is one of the biggest misunderstandings about the First Amendment, right up there with the whole religion thing, is the idea that just because I'm entitled to free speech and entitled to freedom of the press, that means that you have to let me say what I want to in your platform.
Yeah. Be like, I can mouth off to a cop all I want.
Yeah, good luck with that. And legally, that's one that's going through the courts right now, is how much right you have to satire of the police. The Onion actually wrote a brief to the Supreme Court defending your right to satirize the police, because we live in the weirdest timeline.
Yeah, not that I agree with everything the police does nowadays, but I'm not gonna mouthing off to them.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm a mentally ill person. I'm very circumspect around the police. Mentally ill people don't come off well opposite the police. But, even leaving that aside, you still have the right to say whatever you want to about the police. How and where you say it is something you need to be careful about. But there is no law on the books saying that you can't criticize the police, because that law would be unconstitutional.
Next one, the press. Is liable? I think it's called liable.
Libel.
Is that protecting against Constitution?
No, libel is not protected. False speech is not protected. Especially, again, if it causes demonstrable harm. The standards of libel, and I am not a lawyer, but the standards of libel vary based on how public a person they are. My right as a private citizen to be protected against people making up outrageous claims about me is different than Joe Biden's, for example, or even Brad Pitt. Brad Pitt is a public figure. I am not.
Like a certain someone slapping someone during the Oscars.
Yeah. I could say whatever I want to about that event. Even if I ran a newspaper, I could print whatever I wanted to opinion-wise about that event. And unless one or the other of those parties could prove that I had acted with actual malice, like intending to hurt them, and that it had caused them harm, they can't do anything about it. Now, if I did that about you, because you are not, a celebrity who is on billions of television screens around the world,
I can't really fight back that much.
Not last I checked. The standards about what I can get away with are different because you are not a public figure in the same way. So libel is its own kind of separate issue, but And in the United States, actually, it is considered an absolute affirmative defense against libel and slander charges that something is true. So you cannot sue for libel or slander if what the person said is, if they can prove it's true, then you cannot win that lawsuit. No matter how harmful the thing is, that it's true is a defense. But other than that, freedom of the press is freedom of the press. The Pentagon Papers back in the 70s were a big test case about this. How much were they allowed to print of these leaked documents? It's back in the news again, the leaking of documents. Someone smuggled out a ton of Pentagon papers from the Pentagon about the war in Vietnam, talking about how pretty much all of the reasons we were there were shown to be false or exaggerated or based on misinformation, and how arguably we were doing more harm than good. And the Pentagon had all of this information, and they were keeping it so that they could keep fighting the war in Vietnam, because the Pentagon's going to Pentagon. And there was a case about, well, did, for example, the New York Times have the legal right to print these papers? And the answer was yes, in fact. Yes, they did.
And finally, the freedom. Oh, hello from Canada.
Hello.
Says to rights for the people to peacefully assemble.
Yeah. Peaceably is the important word there these days.
So, and yeah, throwing a rock in the window, I guess that makes it not.
Yeah, hitting people with fire extinguishers and breaking windows and pooing on the Speaker of the House's desk and things like that are generally not considered peaceably assembling. Supreme Court has also held that they can require you to have a permit for your assembly. You can be required to have a permit for your march, so that, for example, and this has come up in my town, the town where I live now, we used to have May Day marches, and they would never get a permit because they were anarchists, and it's a whole thing. But where they marched was really close to one of the local hospitals. And they wanted to know where the march was going to be so they could reroute ambulances. And you can be arrested for, not getting a permit for your march. But if you can show that they are deliberately blocking permits for marches based on, for example, political reasons, or, they don't like your ethnic group or religion or what have you, I mean, good luck, but you can sue. That, if you can show that your government is being unjust in that, then you can get redress, but it is legal to require a permit.
Yeah, and unfortunately, much as that includes, I said that includes people we may not agree with too. Like, there's streets in like the KKK. They can assemble. We might not like it, but
yeah,
unfortunately, it's their right.
They have the same constitutional amendment, same constitutional rights as everyone else. Odious, yes, they are, but they still have those legal rights. And if the danger is always,
once if they start say lynching somebody in the middle of the protest, then that's a little different story.
Yeah, that is not a peaceable assembly. What you get away with may vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but if you stop being peaceful, then you are legally considered to be forfeiting your First Amendment right of freedom of assembly.
I think my favorite recent example of this is 2 years ago or 3 years ago now. I think when the when when they were I think they were peacefully assembled when they were thrown out of the church so the president could
Yep.
get a Bible picked
Yep.
upside down.
Oh, yeah. Because he's a good Christian.
Yeah. All right. That's one. There's another. The next one is something a lot of people like to talk about too.
Number two. And, my favorite story about number two is I used to pick my son up at his bus stop, and there was another parent there who I would talk to occasionally. And I mentioned something about the first clause of number two, the well-regulated militia part. Because that's, again, the part that people don't seem to remember is there. And he asked me when they had added it. And I told him 1789, and he didn't believe me. And then I pulled out my pocket constitution, because of course I own a pocket constitution. Well, for one thing, the ACLU was giving them away free a while back, and I ordered one because, hey, free constitution. But the well-regulated militia thing, what people don't remember is we didn't have a standing army in 1789. There was no United States Army. Part of that was under the Articles of Confederation. We couldn't pay for one.
Just because then the states would agree.
Right. The federal government had no power of taxation under the Articles of Confederation. It relied basically on donations from the states. And if the states did not want to donate, they didn't. And so we didn't have a standing army because we couldn't pay for one.
Yeah, this was back during the days of who has more power, the federal government or the each individual state?
Yeah.
Are we a country of are we a country of different are we a country of different states or are we one country?
It's been pointed out by people more knowledgeable than I am that one of the interesting differences post-Civil War was in grammar.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Because it went from the United States are to the United States is. But because we didn't have a standing army, it was basically, you never know when you might need to defend your home from the British.
And also another thing, I don't know if it's that relevant or not, that to culture of times too.
Yeah.
Back then, people not just for perspective, people need guns to get food.
Right. There was a lot of hunting.
Yeah, there's no you can't go to Walmart to get a steak. You have to go kill.
And depending on where you were, there were dangerous animals. If it was a choice between, even if you were not hunting and you were raising, pigs and beef cattle and what have you, but there were bears in your area. Yes, you were going to want, to be able to kill the rattlesnakes and the alligators and depending on who you are, the traders too. But, so a lot of the uses for guns at the time were a lot more practical than I have a gun because I can have a gun. Also, let's be real, even when we did first have a standing army, the U.S. standing army was not notably better equipped than it was possible for the average citizen to be. I personally couldn't make a cannon, but I know people who can. Ren Fair will do that for you.
That's another thing I like about people. They think maybe this is their opinion or my opinion, but they think owning a little handgun is the same thing as owning a Magnum bazooka
or a fighter jet. My friends may be skilled, but I don't think any of them can build even like a B-2 bomber by themselves.
But it's my right to own this B-2 bomber and fire it whenever I want to.
Yeah, exactly. So it was a very different culture. There were very different needs, and a lot of Supreme Court decision ink has been spilled on things like the placement of commas in this amendment, because it is not as clear as I would like. Even if I were a strict constructionalist, which I am so not, the construction is bad from a grammar standpoint, and it's ambiguous. And
yeah, my dad owned a gun, but he didn't go around doing stuff with it.
yeah, I've
It was,
known people I consider to be safe gun owners and people I've considered to be actively dangerous gun owners, and more than a few in between. And we need common sense gun legislation has long been my stance. And the problem is, because of how the Second Amendment is written, it is possible for even the most common sense gun law to get stricken down as violating it, because who the hell even knows what it says?
yeah. Other thing I like people who say we should like if someone says we should help, like make it harder for certain people to get like crazy people to get guns, or harder to like get guns to kids. And they're like, they're gonna take away all my guns. No, I did not say that.
Well, and we had a couple of gun control amendments here, initiatives. I mean, here in Washington a few years ago, and I got a call that I am 99% certain was an NRA push poll, asking me about these initiatives. And one of the questions they asked was if I wanted to keep guns out of the hands of law-abiding citizens, or, and this is a direct quote, which I still remember, dangerous mentally ill people. Now, a couple of points here. Number one, the law they wanted to keep from being passed would have required background checks. And if you can tell me how to keep a gun out of the hands of a mentally ill person without a background check proving their history of mental illness, I'm all ears. Number two, mentally ill people are far more likely to be the victims of violent crime than the perpetrators of violent crime. And number three, I am mentally ill. I'm bipolar. It's one of the reasons we don't have a gun in my house, because the highest risk for having a gun in your house is actually an increased risk of suicide. And I'm not saying I would, but I'm saying this is the kind of thing you need to be aware of. And I did not yell at the person who was doing this poll that I was taking part in on the phone, because I was also fairly sure she was just doing her job. And as a person who has worked in phone service, I don't.
But I like it how they say it. It says they put all in one word: normal citizens and
Yeah. Mentally ill people are not citizens, apparently, which is news to me. But, again, I didn't yell at this person, but I was like, yeah, I see what's happening here. And then I ranted about it to all of my friends. But the fact is, we can't do anything with guns without it being at a Second Amendment risk, because the amendment is short, ambiguous, and over 200 years out of date. Because, define arms. Do you have a right to a musket? Do you have a right to a bazooka? Do you have a right to a nuclear warhead? All of those count as arms, and it gets to a point where everyone agrees the average citizen shouldn't have it. But where that point is changes wildly based on the stance of the person you're talking to.
Yeah. All right. Next one, I don't think it's as controversial, but let's find out.
There has literally never been a Supreme Court case that relied on the Third Amendment. The Third Amendment is the least controversial amendment in the entire Constitution.
Now, I'm guessing this took place when during the Revolution, British people were like, "Hey, I live here now."
Well, there were no barracks. During the colonial era, there were no barracks. So the soldiers stayed in private homes, they stayed in inns, they stayed, wherever the army decided to put them. And sometimes people were compensated and sometimes they weren't. And it was a really complicated issue, for, say you ran an inn and it was your livelihood, and oh wait, suddenly 3/4 of your rooms are being taken up by soldiers and you're not getting paid. And so it's a very, very important issue in the 1780s and just never comes up. There have been a couple of people who have tried Third Amendment challenges, but there has never been a case heard by the Supreme Court where the results depended on the Third Amendment.
Number 4.
Yep. This one is, I believe, based on Old English common law, which a lot of American law is, except in Louisiana where they do the Napoleonic Code. And it's basically why the police have to get a search warrant. And why they have to get an arrest warrant. And, basically there has to be a paper trail so that we don't have people being disappeared into, for example, prisons run by, the Archbishop of Canterbury, which apparently was happening for a while under Charles II. Charles the First.
Oh, the one that got
yes.
hit. Yeah, I earned this problem back in the 80s and 90s when I used to play on school computer. I used to play Carmen Sandiego,
Yes.
and sometimes I forgot the warrant and criminal got away.
Yeah. And it's basically taking the risk that sometimes people will get away so that the innocent are protected. Yeah, Charles in Parliament, that was a whole big thing. The whole balance in criminal law is between the risk of damaging the innocent versus the risk in letting the guilty go free. And the consensus has historically been, we would rather let the guilty go free. And the Fourth Amendment is one that is, again, in the law or in the news right now because it turns out that I guess they just give away classified documents as napkins in the White House, based on everything I can tell. But certainly no one wants to do away with this one, except for, certain extremists who just want everybody locked up who isn't them personally.
Yeah. Number 5. This one I've heard a lot of times.
Yeah. I was actually just watching a Rockford Files episode the other day that relies on this one. And I don't remember if this is still true or not, but in theory, if you are held in contempt before a grand jury, you can be locked up until the end of the grand jury session, and then in theory it could just keep happening and you could be in prison for contempt indefinitely. And the reason it came up was that Jim was using his Fifth Amendment rights to try to avoid testifying because the guy didn't believe what he was saying. And so, Fifth Amendment is very, very important. And the important thing is standing on your Fifth Amendment rights is not intended to be a proof of guilt. If you don't want to testify, you legally don't have to testify, and it doesn't mean you're guilty. It just means you are choosing not to
Yeah,
testify.
it mean, because you never know. You might say something which you think is innocent, but some people could use
Right.
that.
Right.
Something.
And it does mean that this also enshrines your right to trial by jury. To protection from double jeopardy. You can't be tried twice for the same crime, which the movie Double Jeopardy is not how it actually works, but the concept is there. You cannot be tried twice for the same crime.
Real fast. I did not know those were part of the same amendment.
Yeah. This is basically, never talk to the cops without a lawyer, even if you're innocent. Always ask for a lawyer. I went to court on a traffic ticket once and asked for a lawyer because I am not a lawyer. Basically, the Fifth Amendment is the single most important amendment as far as your rights in the criminal justice system.
The last time I saw that in a movie was, have you watched No Way Home yet?
Yes.
Where Aunt May and MJ are like, don't talk to that my lawyer.
Yeah.
When they're going by.
Yeah.
Because Peter would say something stupid.
I the first science lesson I remember learning, I learned from Peter Parker at the age of about 4 or 5. I learned which one was stalactites and which one was stalagmites in a Spider-Man comic in Electric Company magazine. But Peter is still kind of dumb.
Yeah, he might be scientifically smart, but he's not that.
Yeah, especially, current Peter is teenage Peter, who is a teenager, and therefore there's a lot of stuff he does not know.
Number 6.
Trial by jury. Yeah.
Of course, I don't think the one is speedy trial. I don't think that's that thing anymore.
The thing about speedy trial is it has to be as speedy as they can get it. And the court system, is busy. Part of the problem is we do not have enough public defenders. A lot of the problems that we have today in the court system would be handled better if we had about 4 or 5 times as many public defenders as we do, because there are a lot of them who basically don't have time to consult with their clients before cases, and there's a lot of problems there that I am not entirely qualified to talk about. But if it takes, 6 months worth of motions and what have you to get your case, but you're still going through the process of the courts the whole time, that is considered a speedy trial. What basically it means is they can't just, not do anything with your case because they don't feel like it, and then 10 years later you get put on trial for something that's been hanging over your head this whole time. I served on a jury earlier this year, and that was a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed it.
Can you talk about it, or is that
Oh
illegal?
no, I can talk now that the case is over. I can talk about it all I want to. You just can't talk about it
During
during the trial.
was it for like a simple
No,
something simple,
it
or
was
was
a
it like a
criminal case. Um, it was a the guy had was up for the third time for violating a restraining order. We didn't fully find out why the restraining order was in place because it had been put in place by the state and not the victim. But reading between the lines, it was domestic violence. He had been in prison twice and done domestic violence counseling twice for violating a restraining order against someone else. And he claimed that he needed to be there to help his fiance, they were still engaged, with her kids. Only when he was busted, he was sitting around on her couch smoking weed and watching the Mariners. So we found him guilty. It was quite the experience, and I thought it was fascinating. Being part of the system like that was a whole side of things, and there were 3 true crime enthusiasts on our jury too. So we all knew a bunch of stuff about the law because true crime.
So it was a unanimous decision, no
No
hung jury or
holdouts.
anything.
It has to be unanimous in order for a guilty verdict to be determined, and it took us, I think, 2 or 3 hours to come to a verdict, and that was partially because one guy felt really bad for her kids and wanted a better outcome, and we pointed out to him that we couldn't do anything about that. All we could do was get this guy out of the house. That was all our job was. But it was our job, and it is an important job. I find the jury is made up of people too smart to get out of jury duty thing really frustrating because the system falls apart without people being willing to be on jury duty. And if the smart people all get out of jury duty, that means that should, God forbid, you end up on trial, then the jury of your peers is not the smart people.
Uh,
And
it also says, sorry, go on.
yeah,
It also says they have the right to be informed of their crime and accusation.
yes.
So you can't just arrest somebody for the hell of it.
Yeah, and there are a lot of countries we could name where people are imprisoned for years without ever finding out why they've been put in prison. And in the United States, man, they have to tell you when they arrest you what they're arresting you for.
And also, the last one. This is the one where you get the right to a lawyer.
Yeah, and how we've seen right to counsel has changed over the years. Currently, you have a right to have a lawyer with you through the entire process, and if you cannot afford one will be appointed for you. But that has not always been seen as your right. For a lot of years, you had the right to an attorney, and if you were poor, good luck with that right.
I guess also, what else is there? Da, da, da. Oh, to be confronted with the witnesses against them. So I guess you had the right. So you have like right to confront your witness.
Well, it's you have the right to cross examination.
Okay.
Yeah, your lawyer. Hopefully, you have a lawyer. Do not defend yourself. Just don't. But your lawyer has the right to cross-examine your witnesses. In most jurisdictions, not all, I don't think, but in most, you have the right to discovery, which is those of us who have seen my cousin Vinny can tell you. Your lawyer has the right to look over what information the prosecution has. Your lawyer can even talk to the prosecution witnesses in advance of the trial. You have the right to all of that information so that you're not going in. The cliche of the surprise witness, uh, depending on your jurisdiction, not even the defense can have surprise witnesses. In a lot of places, the prosecution has right to discovery. And any surprise witness is just going to get thrown out.
Number 7.
Yeah, this one could use a little bit of revision, because $20. But in theory, in any civil case where the value of the controversy is more than $20, you can have a jury trial. Now, in practice, I forget how much small claims court goes to, but small claims court is just a judge, and most people are fine with that. But in theory, your constitutional right says you can have a jury trial for that piddling little amount.
All right. Like you owe me $25 for lunch. No, take you to court.
Yeah. In theory, it would be not worth your time and money, but in theory, you could do a jury trial over $25 for lunch.
I think that's pretty much basic.
Yeah.
Besides the amount thing, I don't think that's changed too much.
No.
Number 8.
This one, the big debate with number 8 is what constitutes cruel and unusual. Because back in the 70s, the Supreme Court threw out the death penalty for a while as being cruel and unusual, and then it was decided that was because of how the death penalty was done at the time, not the actual methods of execution, but the court proceedings. And then that got overturned a while later, but it wasn't retroactive. So there were a bunch of people, Charles Manson, most famously, was given the death penalty, but his death sentence was thrown out by that Supreme Court decision. And then when the law changed again, it wasn't retroactive. So he died in prison, an old and not stable man. But what's excessive, what's cruel, what's unusual, those are all really, really vague. And as the last one showed us, setting what excessive was, theoretically could mean that it was illegal to have any fines over $100, which for someone on my income is one thing, but for a major corporation, they can afford a bit more than that. So it's good that it's left vague, but that has caused a lot of back and forth over the years.
And they also have different prices for different types of crime too.
Yeah. And the debate about cash bail these days stems in part from an Eighth Amendment discussion. Because for a lot of people, cash bail is excessive. Just full stop. And not being able to have it makes things worse, because then they lose their jobs, and it's just, even when they're later found not guilty, they're still out.
So cash bail means you have to pay. So that means you have to pay in cash, or what?
Yeah, well, it means that instead of an ankle monitor or some other method of tracking the person if they've been released from jail waiting for their trial, they have to pay actual money to get out of prison. And yes, you get your bail back, but if you've lost your job and all of that in the meanwhile, That doesn't do you a lot of good.
And that's what people bill jumpers, that someone pays their bill and they leave, and then
Yeah.
those people are out of.
Yeah, most private detectives make most of their money tracking bail jumpers. I knew one once actually who used to hang out in the public library doing. I mean, this was the late 90s, so it wasn't Google yet, but doing internet searches looking for people who had skipped bail. And that was what he did all day. But yeah, what's excessive, what's cruel, what's unusual?
Number 9.
Basically, just because it's not in the Constitution doesn't mean you don't have that right. And this one comes up a lot in right to privacy discussions, because the right to privacy is not explicitly a constitutional right. You know, as we go through these amendments, we will not find a constitutional right to privacy. But per the Ninth Amendment, there's nothing that's, there's no rule that says you can't have a right to privacy. Just as it is not in the Constitution that dogs can't play baseball.
Right, so I think that's pretty much self-explanatory. Yep. The last one of the Bill of Rights
basically says if it's not in the Constitution and it's not banned by the states, whatever you do, you.
Has that ever been an issue at all?
It comes up occasionally, especially in the gray area between what's federal power and what's state power. Which is who has more power has gone back and forth a lot over the years. It comes up. It comes up a lot more often than the Third Amendment, but a lot less often than the First or the Second or the Eighth, for example.
Yeah. Like, would last year's Supreme Court abortion thing be a thing like that?
Yeah. This is another one that kind of ties into the right to privacy and things like that, where it's like, well, there's no constitutional law against it. Do the states have the authority to regulate this, or do they not? And it's I think that's another place where we're going to have to end up getting a constitutional amendment at some point, and boy, good luck with that. Just because in polls the majority of people are at least vaguely pro-choice doesn't mean they're going to pass a constitutional amendment enshrining the right to abortion.
Number 11.
But this is one of the ones that I'm not enough of a lawyer to fully understand the 11th Amendment. It's a lot to do with who can sue the United States, who can sue which states, can the states sue one another, can the U.S. sue states, can states sue the U.S.? I don't know. There are whole classes in law school that are basically the 11th Amendment.
Yeah.
And it came up because it was one of the big questions in the early, this is 1798. We hadn't even got a full decade yet. But because it was the transition from the Articles of Confederation, where it was all state, no federal, to the Constitution, which is some state, some federal, there was a transition going on.
Well, I think one of the big things like this time was probably the battle between. I think I've heard this before. When New Jersey and New York were battling over the river rights of the.
Yeah. And there were some trade routes that one state had assigned to one place, and then the federal government gave someone else a monopoly, and, they weren't used to working together yet. And so that got all messy and complicated. And then when the 11th Amendment got passed, all of the lawsuits about the whole issue just got thrown out blanket because they were all covered by the 11th Amendment. Go away.
Number 12. Number 12. Okay. Turn, please. Yeah, there he is.
Yeah. So it turns out that the way that we used to elect president and vice president was kind of,
the loser became vice president.
yeah, it was complicated and had some results that we didn't intended. And it turns out that in all of the fighting about the phrasing and so forth of that part of the Constitution, we left in some pretty serious errors. And so the 12th Amendment is just like, let's fix that, and let's make it as clear as we can, which is why it's as long as it is, so that there is no arguing about all of this.
Yeah, it's like before, like if it's still in effect today, that would mean Biden would be president and Trump would be vice president.
Yeah, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but basically yes. And so that's how we ended up with Aaron Burr as vice president. And boy, he and Jefferson did not get along at all. And Jefferson cut Burr out of power. And it's this whole big, complicated thing.
Especially after the vice president killed the guy.
Killing. Yeah. It's vice president kills a secretary of the Treasury. That always looks good. And then he ran off to the South and committed treason. And yes. Aaron Burr was a fascinating guy. And, I tend to joke that you can tell how much discussion there was about any given part of the Constitution by how long that section of the Constitution is. Like, nobody debated the importance of a Supreme Court, which is why that article of the Constitution is so short and basically says, we should have one of those.
How much longer?
And everything else about it is just left out. What the requirements are, how many people are going to be on the Supreme Court, there's nothing. So the 12th Amendment is really, really long because they wanted to make sure that nothing like the 1800 election happened again.
Is this the one that talks about the electors, the main constitution?
Yeah. The House of Representatives, and the electors, and the number of electors, and the quorum, and the everything. Because they wanted to be sure that the next election and the election after that, and so on, would work the way it was supposed to.
I think the next one is pretty self-explanatory, but
yep.
Because 1804 to
1865, and there's a very good movie about the passing of this one.
I don't think this will be overturned anytime soon.
No. And Lincoln was very determined to get this passed before the war ended because he wanted it to be the law of the land when the Confederacy returned to the United States. He wanted there to be no room for discussion, no room for argument. There would be no more slavery in the United States.
And that's why some of them moved to Brazil.
Yeah, well.
That's a different story.
Yeah. The important section of this one currently is except as a punishment for crime, because there is still slave labor in this country and it's all done in prisons. It is illegal to import anything into the United States that was made by prison labor, but there are still a lot of things made in the United States by prisoners.
All right. Number 14. First section.
Yeah. Citizenship. This is where birthright citizenship is doubly enshrined. It's in the original Constitution, as I recall, but here it's made very, very clear that everyone born in this country is a citizen of this country, regardless of the citizenship status of their parents. And this was originally because slaves weren't citizens.
And that's the argument where people cross the border just to give birth.
Yeah. Yeah, which happens a lot less often than certain people would have you believe, in no small part because, man, it is hard to cross the border if you don't have the right documentation. And having been pregnant 3 times, I wouldn't want to cross the border 9 months pregnant. If you are strong enough to get yourself across the border 9 months pregnant, by gods, we need more people like you, is my personal stance. But, the original intent was no one would be able to say that people who had been enslaved and people whose parents had been enslaved weren't citizens.
Let's see. Section 2. Representatives for those people, I guess.
Yeah. This is also basically this is a response to the 3/5 compromise.
Oh yeah, when they said three out of 5 of you can be used for taxes and representatives.
Yeah, and there's a lot to say about the 3/5 compromise.
Because I may be wrong. If I remember the fight correctly about that, it says the South wanted to use the slaves as used for more. We have 20 slaves, that's 20 more votes in the thing, and they're like, that's 20 more taxes too. Like, no, they don't tax them. Just representative.
Yeah. It was basically they wanted the slaves to be counted as population for terms of representation, because it gave the slave states more power. But all they wanted was the benefits of that population. They didn't want any of the negatives. And the North didn't want the slaves counted as population because they weren't in any other way treated as population. And so that's where the 3/5 compromise comes from. And it is awful. It was a horrible system for really everybody. But it was there for a reason, and without it, there arguably would not have been a United States. And this was basically like, no, if they can't vote, they don't count.
Well, back then, that included poor people too, poor white people too.
Yeah, I mean, it depended a lot on what state you were in. Voting requirements used to vary a lot more by state than they currently do, and they still do some, especially if you've ever been convicted of a crime. But, women, obviously, across the board. A lot of places, poor people couldn't vote. There were places with poll taxes. There were places with reading requirements.
Oh.
And that got worse under Jim Crow.
Yeah, we'll get to that one in the next one.
Yeah.
Just a second.
This one is, Section 14 is currently coming up these days. There are people who want certain people to be banned from Congress because they committed treason a couple of years ago, and I'm here for that. So,
like the former Confederate people that left the Congress and we're back. Like, no.
Yeah, exactly. Like there were a lot of senators, representatives who left Congress in 1860, 1861, and were like, well, we're back now. And this basically said, no, you're not. Unless Congress voted by 2/3 of each house to let them. And there are some people who I believe today should be kicked back out of Congress because they were, encouraging insurrection a few years ago. And
whatever thing do you mean by that?
Gosh.
What do you mean?
there are some court cases currently going that might ban certain people from Congress if they succeed, and I'm here for it. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Yeah, basically, you can't make the U.S. pay for Confederate debt, is what this says.
Yeah, it's your problem.
Yeah.
Not ours.
Do what you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
The voting one. All men can vote now.
All men can vote now. Citizens. The previous condition of servitude is, I think, going to be an interesting point coming up for prison for ex-felons voting, because there are a lot of places in the United States where convicted felons permanently lose their right to vote, and I think the current Supreme Court would throw it out, but I think an upcoming Supreme Court could arguably make a 15th Amendment decision that you cannot ban felons from voting.
We talked about this last one. Also, I took in some of one time a few years ago. We took one of those South voting tests.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
on the podcast. We had to pass this.
Those are a lot. I've taken one of those.
Like, I don't think even a normal person nowadays can pass some of these.
Oh no.
All in 10 minutes too.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, like I said, of course, this is just every citizen man above 21.
Yeah, it is still limited to men, and there is still, native populations were not necessarily included in this.
And of course, how they what's the word? Enforce that.
Yeah. You'll note Section 2 there. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation, was basically saying, don't mess with us, states. Congress can do this.
Of course, like people like, oh, you can vote. You'll die if you vote, but you can vote.
Yeah.
Good old Jim Crow.
Oh yeah.
Oh, another time jump, the 70s to 1913.
Yep. And this is an appropriate weekend to be discussing the 16th Amendment.
Oh yeah. It's today's tax day.
Well, technically Monday is, because tax day never falls on a weekend. But yeah, it is tax weekend. I've got a friend who's an accountant this is his busy time. But this is what establishes the IRS right here. And it is why blue states are currently supporting red states, because they don't have to get the money back that they put into the system.
I got mine done in January, February, and I used it to buy a PS5.
Nice. I have no taxable income, so I'm on disability. I don't have anything, but we got my partner's done a while back. I consider myself a failure if his taxes aren't done by mid-March. So
yeah, I try to get mine done as soon as possible. Not only because that's where I get my actual fun, and that's where I usually get my fun income. Not I need this for bills to survive food income.
Oh, absolutely. Well, with us, it took as long as it did because his employer took too long giving him his W-2s. So, but yeah, this is, regardless of what sovereign citizens say, The 16th Amendment is right there, and it says the IRS is constitutional.
And I think before this, most of the money came from tariffs.
Yeah. Before this, basically the only system the United States had of raising money as a nation was tariffs. The states could tax things, but the power of the federal government to tax really stems from the 16th Amendment. And, this is in the lead up to World War I. And I don't think anybody knew exactly when World War I was coming, but I also don't think it took a lot of foresight to know that a war was coming. Because the alliances were really, really complicated and everybody was building a whole lot of weaponry.
It's like, what? War in Europe? That never happened.
Yeah, no.
Not happening now, for sure.
Yeah. But, this is where the transition to a strong federal government arguably starts, is with the 16th Amendment. Because you can afford a strong federal government when they have taxes.
Next one, if I remember correctly, I think it might be controversial to some people.
Yeah. So we used to appoint senators from the Congress.
The state, the state
House.
For me, it'd be from Columbus, or
you
from.
Mine are just downtown from me because I live in my state capital, Olympia, Washington. But the Lincoln-Douglas debates are referred to as him debating to be a senator, but technically they weren't, because senators were still appointed by Congress at the time. So none of those people he was debating in front of were going to be able to vote for him anyway.
Unless they're debating in front of the state.
Right, which they weren't.
People.
At the time,
people were like, "We like that guy." State people like, "Good for you. We're going to."
Exactly. Some of the shenanigans with the Senate pre-17th Amendment were just, Now, I don't think I think this is another one where there haven't been any Supreme Court cases based on it, because it's dealing with a very, very specific, very, very limited problem. But it was basically like, you know what? Let's give a little bit more power to the people.
I've heard there's some people that actually want to repeal this one.
Well, I mean, there are people who want to repeal everything, so I'm not surprised. But I think that the idea would be, you can't gerrymander a senator. Because everyone in your state votes for both senators. So your senator is always going to be more reflective of the actual political makeup of your area than your state house necessarily will be, because you can draw district lines to divide up your state house in a much more partisan way, so that a party that does not necessarily have the numbers of popular support still wins in the state house all the time. And you can't do that with senators, because everybody votes for senator.
This one.
19th Amendment. Or 18th Amendment, rather. 1919. Mostly passed because of World War I, because all the people who would have voted against it were off surfing in World War I.
I think there's also a different time, too, where people drank a lot more than they do now.
Yeah. No, people drank a ton. And what's more, if you read the amendment itself, it doesn't define intoxicating liquors. And a lot of people who voted for it thought that intoxicating liquors specifically would imply, like, spirits. And were shocked when the laws passed actually outlawed things like beer and wine. And so there was a bit of a bait and switch played with this amendment. And it had the benefit of all of the young men, well, not all, but many, many young men being off at war. And so this one kind of snuck in through a combination of luck and deceit and was a terrible, terrible idea.
Yeah. Because you know when you make something illegal, that's the end of the day. Nothing that happens.
Well, and not only that, but like, I don't drink and I know how to make alcohol at home. Like, alcohol is the most you accidentally can make alcohol at home.
Just the I don't think I did, but one time I actually had a piece. I don't think it was alcohol because I think you add some more stuff to it. But I drank some like 2-month-old grape juice from my backpack.
Yeah, that is probably fermented, and that is probably, I mean, low levels of alcohol, but that probably has alcohol in it. They used to sell these bricks of, during Prohibition, they sold these bricks of grape juice concentrate. And there would be instructions printed on the packaging with things like, do not reconstitute this and put it in a bottle in a dark closet for such and such a length of time, because then it would turn into wine and that would be bad.
Wink, wink.
You know, I mean, not only were they banning a substance that is extraordinarily popular, they were banning a substance that is extraordinarily popular and extraordinarily easy to manufacture. And so it failed, because of course it did.
And here comes the Congress have the power to enforce these things they
Yep.
want to. But a lot of them probably didn't.
No, there were a lot of people in Congress who were well stocked with alcohol. There was a bootlegger to Congress. I mean, this was just not enforced and not enforceable.
Yeah, even though that's why I think that's why they had to get the federal cops into some of these things, because the local cops were like,
well, and there were, I forget how many Prohibition agents there were for the entire nation, but it was not a lot, because they didn't budget for a lot of Prohibition agents, because, you know, by taking away things like alcohol taxes, you have just cut off a large amount of income, and B, they didn't want to enforce it. So yeah, there was just, it was a joke. And that just made the bootleggers, you know, fashionable and cool. And
yeah, I like that. You talk about tax, like I like how all of a sudden, like Colorado has all these taxes. Surplus I can use.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No,
They,
Washington, same thing. You know, we actually passed our legalization on the same day as Colorado, but they're a time zone ahead of us, so they get all the press. Because they were technically first by an hour. You know, and we have a ton of tax money from the like 8 different dispensaries within 5 miles of my house. You know, that we aren't now spending on busting everyone in the state who's trying to sell weed.
Yeah, and you can, if it ever becomes legal in Ohio, I thought about this. If it ever becomes legal in Ohio, I thought about like making my own little strain thing. Like, hey, I'm gonna make this, crossbreed some plants. Yeah. You know, get the natural selection going, or artificial selection. Get better this, better that. I thought about that. All right, I think the next one. I don't think it's controversial, but some people might disagree. Women can vote now.
Yeah. Oh, there are some people who don't like that one, but I'm a fan. I mean, there were states who had. Wyoming was the first state where women had the right to vote, but they couldn't vote in federal elections because it was against federal law. Utah actually passed the right to vote fairly early, because then all the Mormon women could vote, and they would vote for Mormons, and that swung elections. So the Western states tended to pass these laws for various reasons before the Eastern states, but Woodrow Wilson for a long time just refused to meet with anyone pressing the right to vote for women. He was very opposed to the whole thing.
Well, Woodrow Wilson wasn't that smart of a guy.
Well, he was
right
smart, but he had some very backwards ideas.
Yeah, like say watching a KKK movie in the White House.
And I've seen that movie, and it's an important piece of film history that I'm certainly never watching again.
Yeah, like let's bring back this almost dead thing and make it natural again.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't see why anybody would be against this amendment, even nowadays.
I believe it starts with
But
M and rhymes with misogyny.
So everyone above 21 can vote now.
Yes.
All right. Double digits now, or XX.
And this was basically, we're starting with January and not March, because at the time, Inauguration Day was in March, and there was a considerably longer, what's called lame duck period. And the longer one made more sense in the days where everybody traveled by horseback, and it took longer to get messages around.
But by this time, trains have happened and cars have happened by now.
Yeah, exactly. It's 1933.
I don't think planes were that thing yet, but they were starting.
There was some commercial air flight, but not a lot. Lindbergh had crossed the Atlantic by this point, and
But I would doubt Air Force One was a thing where you could.
It was not yet, but there was still, much more rapid travel and certainly more rapid communication.
Yeah.
This is just as television is starting up.
Yeah, I think. Oh, it was dangerous, like dirigibles, like the Hindenburg.
Yes.
Yeah, let's put hydrogen gas in a balloon.
It worked until there was all that lightning.
Then they're like, "Hey, this is helium. Oh, hey, this is light too. This catch on fire."
Yeah, well, hydrogen was cheaper.
Yeah, so this is like we get the log in faster and the other guy out sooner.
Yeah.
So I guess maybe also in the last 2 months before he got kicked out, they could do some stuff they wanted to.
Yeah, there was a lot of judicial stuff that was done in those last couple of months. And various other, let's get some stuff in real fast that we know that people don't approve of, but we can because we've got these extra 2 months. So it's like, let's maybe trim that, give them less time to do that, because it's not like he's got to, ride across 7 states on horseback. I mean, he can, but he doesn't have to.
So at least once every a year. So
yeah.
Does that mean technically they can go one time and then leave?
Technically, Congress only has to assemble at noon, presumably Eastern time, on the 3rd of January.
Sometimes it feels like they do that sometimes.
I mean,
But that's a different thing. Let's see.
Yeah, and this is basically enshrining in law the succession. Because technically, up until 1933, there was no law saying who took over after something happened to the president.
It just happened to be this happened to be it's me.
Yeah. the first vice president, I believe it was Tyler, was the first vice president.
With William Henry Harrison, who 30 days in his office, like
33. Yeah, he also delivered the longest inaugural address. It was something like 3 hours.
Yeah, I heard it's a myth about that he didn't die of pneumonia. He died of like water poisoning or whatever water is in the water system.
No, it's oh gosh, not Harrison, but the next one who died in office supposedly died of cholera.
Yeah, that's a disease.
But Harrison's vice president was referred to for his entire term of service after Harrison died as his accidency by people who didn't like him and didn't think he should have been president. So this is basically saying, no, but really, this is how it works. Yeah, okay, we've done this like 6 times now, but from here on out, this is officially how it works.
But there was just the one that also was talked about the Speaker of the House is next, or is that the future one?
I believe that's not in the Constitution. I believe that is just federal law. Because it's never come up, so they don't feel the need to put it in the Constitution, is my suspicion.
Okay.
But there is a federal law, and it goes through the Speaker of the House and the President pro tempore of the Senate, and then
all the cabinet members and
all the cabinet members, and yeah, and so you end up with like
are established.
The Secretary of Agriculture or something sitting out the State of the Union address just in case.
Yeah. Where's our Secretary of Internet?
I did know that about John Tyler's grandson.
Oh yeah, I think I heard about that.
A bunch of people got married late is basically the version.
And then their kids got married late.
Yeah.
But yeah, we need a Secretary of YouTube rights.
I mean, a Secretary of Internet is probably forthcoming at some point. Secretary of Communications, I would suspect, is a cabinet post that will probably exist at some point. Because the cabinet is not set by the Constitution. It is set by federal law. So...
Now this is interesting. If something happens, the House can choose a president and the Senate can choose a vice president.
Yeah, and this has happened once. Gerald Ford took over after Spiro Agnew resigned because of a few little tax issues he was having. And Congress appointed then Senator, as I recall, Gerald Ford. And then Nixon resigned. And without having been elected to anything, Gerald Ford became president.
I think the other one was during the Jackson and Quincy Adams election.
Well, that was about the House of Representatives deciding the election. And it was based on who had a plurality and who had a majority, because no one had a majority. And that was a complicated, like, the Electoral College didn't make a decision, so it got thrown into the House of Representatives. But this was literally, Gerald Ford was not elected vice president. He was appointed vice president under the 20th Amendment. And then Nixon resigned and Gerald Ford became president, also under the 20th Amendment.
21.
Oops, my bad. Yes, that was the 1820 election.
You're like, hey, you know that thing you said about alcohol? You can do it again.
Yeah. Whoops, our bad. Here, have a beer.
I think this is pretty much...
Yeah, this is just like, yeah, never mind. All of that stuff, never mind. They're booze again, no laws, blah, blah, blah.
Like, please stop buying from gangsters.
Yeah, basically.
I think that's when they came to power, really.
Yeah. Organized crime really got its hold during Prohibition. Because, of course, it did.
term limits.
Term limits. This is basically FDR's amendment.
Because before, it wasn't said. It was more tradition.
Yeah, it was tradition. The thing is George Washington didn't want to be president. And they told him, a bunch of delegates went to Washington and said that if he didn't take the job as president, which everybody knew was intended to go to him the first time, if he didn't take the job, it would be seen as proof that he didn't believe in the United States as a concept. And he sighed, and he went and he became president.
Yeah, I heard at least the first two elections, he was saying he didn't really have that. There was a big gap between electoral votes.
Yeah, there were no other electoral votes. It was everybody voted for Washington. And the thing is he didn't want to run the second time. And they told him that if he didn't run the second time, then it would be seen as him saying that the country was a failure. And he, fine, and he became president.
And then third time he's like, okay, enough.
Third time he's like, nope, I'm done. I'm going home.
It's like, and they're like, oh, he's like, wow, he's a good example for us.
And from then on, and I mean, and that included people like Teddy Roosevelt, who even under the 22nd Amendment, Theodore Roosevelt would have been qualified to run for another term.
He did technically try to.
He did, and he didn't win. But what I'm saying is, even if the 22nd Amendment had been in place, he would have been eligible for that run because he'd served less than 2 years of McKinley's term. McKinley was more than 2 years into his term when he died. And so he would have been eligible for another term under the 20th Amendment. Didn't matter because it hadn't been passed yet. But this was basically because FDR felt that he was the only person who really was capable of getting the United States through World War II. That's why he kept running.
Yeah, and first, it's funny that both FDR and Hitler came to power at the same time.
Yeah,
different results.
Yeah, and we were extremely isolationist in 1940. Like, people forget this now, but FDR was practically alone in saying, hey guys, I'd really like to help
the people over there.
Yeah, like, be prepared for this war that is going to take us whether we wanted to or not.
No, make it this way. Oh, look, there's Nazi subs off the coast of New York.
Yeah. And so he ran in 1940 because he knew that the US was not going to avoid World War II. And no one else running seemed to know that. And then in 1944, he ran because it was war and he was president.
I think the same thing happened with Wilson.
Well, I mean, Wilson had 2 terms. Wilson,
but I'm never mind.
Wilson ran in 1912 and won, and then ran in 1916 under the slogan, "He kept us out of the war."
And a year later, we were in that war.
And a year later, we were in the war, and he had a stroke, and his first lady basically ran the country for a while. And then he left office in 1920 because he would not have won. In his state of health, there was no way. But
I'm surprised. This one, I'm surprised that they didn't make the vice president during this.
Well, Edith Wilson lied about how bad off he was. She would say, "Oh, I'm taking these documents in to have the president sign them. No, you can't come in." And everybody went, "Well, okay, I guess so." And then she'd bring out the signed documents. She was running the country. arguably our first female president was Edith Wilson. And that's part of why the succession was set the way it was, because of the Wilson thing. But this specific one is aimed at, we are not going to let another FDR happen. And it wouldn't have applied to Truman had Truman won in 52. Because it specifically says that it won't apply to whoever is in during the term within which this article becomes operative. But all presidents after, and of course Truman didn't win in 1952, but all presidents from that point on were going to be limited to no more than, realistically, 9 years, 364 days.
Yeah, I think it's 2 terms plus 2 more years if they were vice presidents, so like 10 years, give or take 10 years in total.
Yeah, no more than 2 years of being president after taking office as being under a vice president or under another president. So,
yeah. All right. 23.
DC can vote for things. The thing is when Washington, D.C. was created, the idea that anybody would actually live there year-round was not considered. So it was like, oh, well, we're gonna, it's not gonna be part of any state, and it's not gonna have its own government, and blah, blah, blah. And the entirety of Washington, D.C. is controlled by Congress. They can set their own laws, but Congress has to approve them. Which is why there's the DC statehood movement, because if you've ever seen a Washington, D.C. license plate, the slogan on it is taxation without representation.
Yeah, I think it's between D.C. and Puerto Rico.
Yeah. Well, Puerto Rico is complicated because there are a lot of U.S. territories. And there are some privileges that you get with being a territory, but there are a lot that come with statehood that you don't get. And there's and not everyone in Puerto Rico wants Puerto Rico to become a state.
I think last time I remember in the 90s, it was a majority of people that did it, at least 30 years ago. I don't know if that's still the same now.
Well, and as I recall, that left out a couple of other options that they could go with.
Like, I think that it was either independent country, become a state, or remain as we are.
Yeah, and I believe there are 1 or 2 other options that some people there support, and it's complicated, and I haven't read about it in a while. I did read a book about all of the U.S. territories at one point that talked a lot about it, but that was a while ago.
But I like the thing where people are like, "Why they give money to Puerto Rico? They're not American citizens."
Yeah, they
are.
Yes, they are. They absolutely are. And I got, they're all in-laws, but I've got family in Puerto Rico, and yeah, they're U.S. citizens, all of them.
They can't vote.
I mean, they can vote for president, I believe, now. But
no, really?
No, that's right. They get delegates at the conventions, but their votes for president don't count. Because, sure. Yeah, and they have limited say in their own local government, and it's this whole big thing, and get most of my Puerto Rican in-laws started on things like disaster relief. Because I have family, distant by marriage, family still living on Puerto Rico who have been through a couple of hurricanes in the last few years, and yeah,
I've had some arguments on Facebook about that.
My father's sister married into a very large Puerto Rican family, and then 2 of her sons married into a different Puerto Rican family. They married sisters. And watching some of them argue with one of my uncle's brothers, who is old and conservative is interesting. They disagree with him about a lot of things. But with DC, it's very, very clear the mandate is there. The people of DC want statehood. And while I understand the historical reasons laid out for why DC is not a state or a part of a state, I also think they don't hold in a current setting where, really, though, people live there.
Yeah, except they probably, before people went there, did their job, and went back home. I'm guessing.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's pretty much self-explanatory. Number 24, almost at the end.
Yeah, this is one that affected my mother, actually. My mother turned 21 January 4th, 1965. Oh no, this is poll tax. Sorry, we're not there yet. But yeah, poll tax was partially a Jim Crow thing. Sorry, I'm skipping ahead in a moment. Don't mind me. Poll tax was mostly a Jim Crow thing. It was also partially a poor people thing, just in general. Initially, they didn't want people like, say, me, to have a vote. I mean, they didn't want me to have a vote for other reasons, but also because I am not a property owner. And I could not afford to pay a poll tax.
I think most property owners can't afford to pay poll tax nowadays.
Oh God, no, nobody can afford it these days. But poll taxes were sometimes applied in slightly more arbitrary fashions than others. And some people were asked to pay them and some weren't, and sometimes they would get grandfathered in, and it was partially a Jim Crow thing, which is why, 1964.
Kind of like a bouncer in a club. Like, you don't need to pay your poll tax. Come on in. You need to pay your poll tax.
Yeah, exactly. And so 1964, the only way to abolish poll taxes.
Make an amendment.
Yeah. Because that was, legally and officially all of the election stuff is set by the state, which is a whole other thing, and don't get me started. But, in order to set any election law on a federal level, it's got to be in the Constitution.
25.
Yep.
I guess
Gerald Ford.
This makes it official.
Yep. And it's only been removal from office or resignation once. Every other U.S. president, either their term has expired, naturally in its time, or they have died.
Naturally. Not naturally, but like this is right after the Kennedy thing.
Yeah. This is under Lyndon Johnson. Who
got sworn in during the plane ride.
Oh, just before, but it was I don't know if you've ever watched Ask a Mortician on YouTube, but she does a deep dive into, she's not talking about the actual assassination itself. She's mostly interested in the funerary issues involved. But she did a video about Dallas and covers the timeline of the day, including Johnson's being sworn in with a presumably fairly freaked out Jackie Kennedy by his side.
Yeah, I think the two things that timeline will characterize is this one and the World War I starting shot killing the Archduke thing.
Yeah. Two of the big examples about why you don't ride around in an open top car if you're famous. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, but this one, I think we talked about it before. This one affirmatively says the
Yeah.
the president can nominate one.
Yeah, because before it was just the Senate's going to appoint somebody, and now it's like, no, the president can appoint somebody, and then yeah. So there was a stretch there, and I don't think it got used during that stretch. Like I'd have to go back and look because I mean I know FDR went through about 3 vice presidents, but partially that was because he just kept running with different guys. Oh yeah, no, the whole thing with Jackie is horribly distressing. Um, and Caitlin Doty's Jackie Kennedy impersonation is kind of a lot too. So, but yeah, basically the 25th Amendment and Lyndon Johnson, who actually was on the Warren Commission, or not Lyndon Johnson, Gerald Ford was on the Warren Commission, had the best attendance record, benefited from yes, this is how things are going to go. And here we get a little bit more of succession.
I don't think it's exactly who's the line of succession, but
yeah. Basically, it's the president has to send everybody a note.
I'm in charge now.
Oh, yeah. And this is getting into the weeds of how exactly everything is going to be done. And they were trying to pull this one on Trump for a while. Have him declared incompetent to serve at the end of his term. But Pence would have had to have been on board on that. And that didn't happen. So
yeah. So I think weird or not weird, but he like the people that want him hung too.
Yeah, like they probably don't know enough of the Constitution to know what he could have done and didn't.
I'm just gonna say, nah, throw this out. Whatever. We're still in charge.
Yep.
Next one, I think some people think is controversial, and that's the lowering the voting age.
Yep. Yeah. And there's a lot of debate about the relative ages of the vote and drinking and things like that, but this is a Vietnam response right here, because 18 is old enough to be in the military. And actually, if you are in the military and 18, I believe you can drink on base. On the grounds of, well, if you're an adult enough to go to war and get shot at, you can drink.
I could be wrong about this, but I think this is the same timeline when the voting age went down to 18, the drinking age went up to 21.
It did, yeah. Yeah. But
now cigarettes are the same, tobacco the same way now.
Yeah.
Very recently.
But the big controversy in the late 60s and early 70s was, I mean, obviously very early 70s, but was being old enough to go to war and not old enough to make the decision about whether your country would go to war. And like, that's legit. Either the draft age needed to be raised or the voting age needed to be lowered. There was this 3-year gap, which is where most people were getting drafted, was in that 3-year gap.
You can go to war, but you can't decide the person to send you to war.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of people were getting drafted out of high school. If they didn't have some kind of deferral, the kids who couldn't afford to go to college were going to Vietnam instead, and they did not have a vote. And so that is mostly where this amendment comes from.
Of course, I think it was time after this they did away with the draft.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah, there is no draft anymore. And actually, my dad was a recruiting sergeant for the Air Force right around this time. And we had a comic strip that my dad had clipped out, something about an all-volunteer army and about how you had to take what you could get. But the fact is, we were talking earlier about juries, but when my dad was initially in the Air Force, a lot of the Air Force was people who couldn't come up with a way to get out of the Air Force.
So now every citizen 18 above, man, women, black, white,
Yeah.
can vote.
Yeah.
And next, the final one is in our life. This one passed in our lifetime, at least in my lifetime, because I'm old. I was 12 when this happened.
Yes. Yeah. I turned 16 that year, so we're about the same age.
Oh, nice. Yeah, and the funny about this one is I heard it was on the books since the beginning.
Yeah, it was proposed. And it had been sitting there for a really, really long time. And if you'll notice, a few of the amendments have things like, if this isn't passed in such and such number of years, it won't take effect. But a few of them specifically say that, and it was always kind of assumed that if it didn't pass in a specific number of years, it wouldn't take effect. But this one had been sitting around since 1789, and then some guy decided it needed to get passed.
I like this. Basically, it means you can't give yourself a pay raise. You have to wait until the next term.
Yeah.
And you have to hope that you get reelected to get the pay raise.
Yeah.
I'll give myself a pay. Yeah.
And part of it was the assumption that the pay raise would then be part of the conversation about whether you would be reelected or not.
But like that, before that, basically says, I'm going to give myself a raise. If I agree, okay, give yourself a raise. We got $200 an hour, an hour a week raise.
Yeah, and I mean, it's... We as a country are not enormously fond of the idea of the career politician. That's one of the reasons we're so big on term limits. And there are problems. There are problems with term limits. Not least being, if you pass term limits, the only people who really know how the system works are the lobbyists. But there is something to be said for, if you pass a law that gives you a benefit, you should have to wait until getting reelected before you get that benefit. Because you are not, in fact, a monarch.
Yeah, I think there's people agree with the Senate, maybe, and the House, but I think the ones people are iffy about are probably the Supreme Court ones.
Yeah. I mean, I think at least one Supreme Court justice needs to be impeached and removed from office, but that's less and less controversial, really.
But that's, again, that's not a term limit.
No, it is not a term limit. And the thing is
that's
it needs to become okay for Supreme Court justices to retire again. Because for a while, what happened was, like, yeah, they could stay in office for freaking ever, but then they would choose not to because they were, in the immortal words of Thurgood Marshall, old and falling apart. And then more and more and more just died in office. No, it was Thurgood Marshall who said that about himself, and then he was replaced with Clarence Thomas.
I think I've heard this before. I could be wrong. What they said is that the thing was they're supposed to be, like, quote not opponent to any person that appointed them.
Yeah, they were supposed. The theory is that the Supreme Court is not bound by politics. And if they have a lifetime appointment and don't have to cozy up to the next administration. Oh, yes, he absolutely is. And be just saying, Clarence Thomas is the one I think should be impeached. Yes. But the theory was that you know, the Supreme Court would not be responsible to the administration that appointed them. They would not be responsible to Congress. They would be an apolitical body. And that is a great theory. The practice has not been doing so well through my adult life. Can't speak much to before that. I mean, there are a few cases I can speak to, but mostly that's Tawny was a terrible person. He's the one who wrote Dred Scott.
Oh, the one where yeah, even though you're in a free state, it doesn't matter your property.
Yeah, no, he was the one who was of the opinion that no black person had any rights that a white person was bound to respect. I have this personal headcanon that what's going on in the Supreme Court right now is Roberts doesn't want to be seen as the next Tawny. And so anytime you see a decision from him where you're like, wait, Roberts voted that way? That's why.
I think the other favorite one was I forget when it was, but the separate but equal.
Yes. Yeah, that's, 1870s, I think. Yeah.
And of course, that wasn't. I don't think they really were equal.
Oh, they almost never were, and that was part of the point. But then, under Brown v. Board of Education, it was basically declared that separate was by definition unequal. Which is... it's been argued that by people who don't know Tawny very well, that he was bullied into it by Buchanan. Buchanan did hope that the Dred Scott would bring the country together, but also I've read enough about Tawny to know that he was just a terrible person.
Who, of course, I've heard Buchanan wasn't that smart, great person either.
Buchanan was not a great person either, though there is some theory that he may have been our first queer president, and that's based on period gossip, which is fun. And he also
he wasn't never married.
Well, he was never married, and he had what was either a boyfriend or a heterosexual life mate. The evidence is not clear as to which one it was. He also said to Lincoln that if Lincoln was half as happy to be entering office as Buchanan was to be leaving it, then Lincoln was one of the happiest men alive.
Yeah, it's funny though. He put the thing on Lincoln's hand or head, but pretty much they left her. Most of them left her in his admission.
Well, to be fair, a lot of them were leaving because Lincoln had been elected, and they were afraid of what Lincoln would do.
But still, Buchanan did nothing to stop him.
Yeah. No, Buchanan just wanted to run away, basically. But I think Roberts is looking at the whole thing from a lens of history in a way that the people who appointed him weren't expecting him to do. And looking at it saying, yeah, I'm not going to be that guy.
Because I don't think that, but then Buchanan, I don't think I think there's no amendment saying states can't leave, but I think it's pretty much established now. Like, no, you're staying.
Well, I know that Sandra Day O'Connor resigned, and Kennedy resigned
over states leaving the country.
Secession is basically assumed to be once you're in, but there is officially no law saying that, because how would you pass that? And the states absolutely seceded over slavery. Like, there's no debating that if you know anything at all about the documents the states passed about
the Lost Cause myth.
Yeah. Like, if you read the constitutions written during the initial secession, they're all talking about how we are leaving to protect our sacred right of slavery. Like, I'm sorry, no. Like, maybe the individual soldiers weren't all fighting for slavery, but the aristocracy was.
Yes. And then later, and it's opposite. Like, I think they changed a bit in the North. some of them cared about slavery, other ones, most of them didn't know. I think, but later on, I think more people cared about slavery in the North.
Yeah.
Like, yeah,
Well, a lot of people never cared about slavery. Honestly, like there were
yeah,
soldiers who went from Gettysburg to New York to put down a draft riot that included murdering black people.
It was the Mexicans were taking our job, but now the slaves taking
Yeah,
our job.
it was freed slaves were taking our jobs. But it wasn't like, oh, slavery is evil kind of caring about slavery. And they didn't care about slavery as long as it was in the South and all of that.
But I heard some people who did that later on, when they went to war and they actually saw it for themselves, they're like, oh, this is actually a real thing.
Yeah, exactly. Like there were, a lot of abolitionists, both made before the war and during the war, who hadn't cared about slavery one way or another, some of them not even in the they're taking our jobs kind of sense, until they actually saw slavery. Lincoln had always kind of been anti-slavery, and then he actually went to New Orleans, and he wasn't a radical abolitionist, but he was definitely a full-on abolitionist from that point on.
Yeah, I think a lot of people that slowly pay the slaves, pay them.
Yeah.
And also, the thing wasn't people get this confused too. That they didn't want to. People didn't want to abolish slavery. They just when they couldn't expand it anymore. New states. The people that already had slaves, they could keep them, but no more new states with slaves.
Yeah, there was a lot of shades of gray in the slave debate. There were people who wanted it completely abolished. There were people who wanted it expanded everywhere, and probably. Well, yeah, that too. Lincoln's family was fairly constantly being displaced by slaveholders, but also eventually he saw slavery. It was like, oh wow, this is really awful. But and his father was, oh boy, his father was awful. But probably 90% of the United States was somewhere in between on the slave debate.
It's funny you mentioned New Orleans because I think Louisiana, because I think it was that, maybe others, I don't think it was other states, but basically in Louisiana and New Orleans, there were some black families that had slaves.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there were black families in a bunch of places that had slaves. And then Don Cheadle's family, actually, he had ancestors who were owned by Seminoles, I want to say. And interestingly, because his ancestors were owned by Native Americans, they weren't freed by the 13th Amendment. That didn't cover Native Americans who were not seen as citizens. They were seen at the time as sovereign nations, completely separate from the United States government. I mean, conquered sovereign nations, God knows, but sovereign nations. And therefore, the 13th Amendment didn't apply to them, because if it did, then all of the benefits of the Constitution applied to them. And so, eventually, the Seminole freed their slaves, but it took a few years for that to happen after the Civil War.
All right. So, wrapping this up, anything you want to talk about or advertise?
Well, I write. Yeah. Well, I do some writing about film. I write for a website, and I'm gonna have to spell the name because it's a stupid name and I hate it. But not my site, whatever. It's a site called the-solute.com, The Salute. And that's a fan-based film website, and it's all essays about all kinds of weird stuff. I have an article that went up today about a minor actor named Chuck McCann, who, among other things, was the voice of Sonny the bird from the Cocoa Puffs ad. He was cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. And I write for that site about 4 days a week. So,
for me, I got a few planned things coming up. Let's get my screen up. real fast, and I'll screen. All right, coming up next week, me and my guest. And they're talking about y'all popular series, Kingdom Hearts, where Disney and Final Fantasy decided to, hey, let's throw some stuff together in a blender and see what sticks.
Oh, I'm familiar with the series, yeah.
Oh, definitely, it was one of my favorite series. Then I can't skip it. Then week after that, the guy in chat here, Indeed, we're talking about his favorite English monarchs, and his top 50, I think, or whatever. We can rank them all from Alfred the Great to Queen Anne, because after that, they're not English monarchs anymore. They're British monarchs.
Technically true.
So yeah. Then in 3, we will be talking about the trilogy of the Robert Downey Jr. Iron Man. And finally, if I get to it, we'll be talking about.
I guess what I'm trying to say is, if you just do it,
but basically,
things
we're
will
talking
turn
about
okay.
unintelligent
Here on
design.
the internet, where information is and the world is full of mistruths, comes a show where you learn what you didn't know you
If we were
wanted to learn.
designed,
Join Vandalia 1998
we might have
and many
some
knowledgeable guests as they
effects
tackle the subjects of biology, history, vaccines,
the
lore,
designer.
geology,
Think
video
what your
games,
opinion is.
cosmology, music, movies, and such more. Talking time with caffeine. Join the gang every Saturday evening, and remember,
never stop learning and enjoy the randomness. But yeah, that's
I'll
my
see you
next month
then.
of broadcasting.
Nice.
It's funny, I people that you're at the nerve, but look at the Brontosaurus one. But anyways, well, thank you for being. Anyways, thank you for being
Thank you
on.
for
Thank
having
you for
me.
explaining the stuff that, at least the best of your ability.
Thank you.
You have anything to say closing wise? Like a catchphrase you want to say?
No, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
All right, as I always say, never stop learning and enjoy the randomness. We'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.
Stand by me. We won't stand by you, and if you trust me, well, I wouldn't have a thing to lie to you. Yeah, for me, I will lie.